Have you ever wondered what if Richard Watterson, instead of being a super cute pink rabbit, were a blue dog with a mischievous look? Well, folks, that's exactly what would have happened if Ben Buchele had stuck to his original plans and sketches for the amazing world of Gumball. We would have had a completely different and much less adorable Richard. And he's not the only character from the amazing world of Gumball who would be completely different. Want to know what other residents of Elmore would have looked like? Then check out this list of 15 cartoon characters we put together just for you. But before we dive into more Gumball characters, let me show you that one of the most beloved characters in animated films would also be very different. I'm talking about Maui. Moana was such a hit that Disney recently announced a live-action adaptation of the film. Actor Dwayne Johnson made the announcement since he voiced Maui in the movie and will portray the character in the live-action version. However, there's a significant difference between the character and the actor who will play him: the complete absence of hair. At least when it comes to the version we saw in the film, because originally Maui would have looked much more like his voice actor, completely bald with his body covered in Maori-style tattoos, even on his head. Nothing against bald characters, but he definitely looks friendlier with hair.
You're doing great.
What? No!
Hades! Another Disney classic, Hercules from 1997, is also getting a live-action adaptation. One of the best characters from the animation would be entirely different: the hero's uncle, the god of death, Hades. In fact, the villain had two different versions before the one that ended up in the film. In the first version, he had a more, let's say, devilish appearance, with red colors and a kind of hair shaped like two horns, very much like a devil. The second version was more sinister and caricatured, giving the god of the underworld the appearance of an old witch. In the end, the bluish version was used, creating one of Disney's best villains to date.
Game, set, match.
Snow White! The first Disney princess would have been completely different from the one we got in 1937, and believe me, it wouldn't have been for the better. The early designs of the princess who was taken in by the Seven Dwarfs featured a character with much larger eyes and a slightly more square face, very similar to an old famous adult animated character named Betty Boop. Due to this not-so-positive resemblance, Disney created another version of the princess, but this time she was only 14 years old. However, since there was a kissing scene with the prince, this very young version was discarded and a 16 to 17-year-old version was officially used in the film.
FBI, open up!
Speaking of younger versions, another Disney princess would have initially been much younger. We're talking about Moana. That's right. Initially, Moana was envisioned as a little girl discovering the world, but as the film's development progressed, Disney realized that a very young character wouldn't be able to carry out most of the actions required by the character, such as becoming a skilled sailor. So, a new design was commissioned, resulting in the character we all came to love in the 2016 film. Darwin, Gumball's buddy and brother, would have had a different version, but just by looking at it, we can still see it's Darwin. He would have been a bit smaller and had larger bulging eyes, more like a fish in an aquarium. Then, in the pilot episode, he would already look different, and in the animated series, he would appear as we all know him.
Huh? Aw, see, that's my...
Gumball. Unlike Darwin, Gumball would have been completely different. Ben Buchele's initial idea was for Gumball to be a black-furred cat wearing an orange beanie. After that, the series creator decided to make the character blue and change some features, making his head less rounded, which even resembles the pilot episode made to convince Cartoon Network to produce the series. After securing studio approval and having more money for animation, Gumball underwent some adjustments and became the character loved by 10 out of 10 people. Just a heads up, we'll still have some other characters from the amazing world of Gumball in this video yet. So if you like this amazing cartoon, comment #Elmore in honor of the city where they all live. Wall-E! Do you remember the friendly little recycling robot who starred in one of Pixar's best animated films? Well, initially the idea was for him to be much more, let's say, robotic. He was supposed to be a bit more square and have two front wheels that would also serve as arms. That's exactly why he was modified. The absence of arms took away some of the humanoid shape of the robot, which would have made it harder for the audience to connect with the character. And honestly, the movie version turned out much better. Te-Kā. Back to Moana, one of the big surprises of the film was discovering that Te-Kā and Te Fiti were the same person. This is because they were originally completely different, and this was undoubtedly a clever move by the Disney team, as it was impossible to imagine that the main villain Te-Kā would be the goddess of creation Te Fiti. But this only happened because Disney didn't use the first artistic concept developed for Te-Kā, which would have been much more humanized and could have given away the surprise. This was definitely one of the best plot twists in animation. Thank you, Disney. Sincerely. Miss Simeon. Going back to Gumball and the residents of Elmore, one of the oldest inhabitants of this incredible world would also be completely different. Gumball and Darwin's teacher would be much, let's say, scarier. She would have much thicker hair and a more orangish fur color. Of course, her appearance wouldn't have been much better. And speaking of her, another character would also have been somewhat different, her great love interest. The Principal Brown. The principal of Elmore Junior High School would also be somewhat different, as he would have had a completely different fur color, leaning much more towards a shade of lilac. Moreover, he would have been so furry that you wouldn't even be able to see his eyes. As we mentioned, when Cartoon Network funded the show, some characters received an upgrade. But if he had so much fur on his face, it wouldn't have been easier to justify his passion for Miss Simeon. Beast! Returning to the world of Disney princesses, one of the studio's greatest classics would have had one of its main characters very different. The former prince who became an uncontrollable temper monster would have been much more grotesque, with some versions even resembling a pig. In another version, he would have looked more like a super furry wolf. And in yet another, he would have appeared more leonine, and we're not talking about the zodiac sign, but his appearance. Finally, to avoid scaring the children who would watch the film, Disney opted for a version that was still monstrous, but combined a bit of the wolf version with the lion version, making him much hairier and even furrier, to portray the cursed man who needed to find true love to return to his original form. Timon and Pumbaa. Speaking of pig-like appearances, let's also add to our list the jungle's most humor-filled duo, the biggest proponents of So initially, the idea was that Pumbaa, in particular, would be much more gloomy and somewhat purplish, with no resemblance at all to the cheerful version we know. Timon, on the other hand, would have had a more pointed snout and a much more conceited appearance, we can say. Thank goodness they went with the versions we saw in The Lion King, much better.
Very nice. Thanks.
And since we mentioned The Lion King, another character from one of Disney's most successful franchises should have had a much more villainous appearance. We're talking about the cruel Scar. Mufasa's jealous and wicked brother was initially designed to be much bulkier and fiercer, but as the film's development progressed, the production decided that he would be much more cerebral and intelligent, which is actually much more dangerous than having a muscular body, so he became slimmer and leaner with a touch of psychopathy. His trademark, after all. There's no other way to describe someone who is willing to get rid of his close relatives just for power. He's also one of the characters from the time when Disney created great villains, but among the worst, without a doubt, we have to highlight Ursula. If you've recently watched the live-action version of The Little Mermaid, you know exactly who we're talking about. The Sea Witch who, for many, is the best Disney villain of all time. Just a little question. Is it strange to miss good villains? Because I do, and DreamWorks has been doing that very well.
Thanks. Good to meet you, too.
But getting back to Ursula, apart from being cruel, she would have had a much more dreadful appearance, as we can see in the early sketches of the villain. As it seemed too strange, other versions were created, leading to the one we saw in Ariel's princess film, which was forever etched in the minds of animated film fans. Speaking of Disney princesses, one of them would have had a totally different version as well. Princess Tiana, the protagonist of The Princess and the Frog, one of Disney's recent classics, had several ideas for her human form to embody the image of the girl from New Orleans, with a dream of owning her own restaurant. There were versions of Tiana in her human form, of course, with shorter hair and a prominent orchid on her head. Another version would have had Tiana with thicker hair and slightly larger eyes. And yet another version would have had the Disney princess with shorter hair and slightly more elegant clothes, in the style of the era in which the film is set. In the case of Princess Tiana, I have to be honest that any of the choices would have been great, and the ones we saw in the film were really cool. Those were the 15 cartoon characters that we brought to you, who would have been completely different in their original concepts. And since we know you enjoy watching cool videos, we picked out 2 more for you to check out right now. I heard this first one is a lot of fun. Click on it and give it a watch.